And we're going to look at the text chapter 24, verse 45, all the way through chapter 25 and verse 30. Title of the sermon is Blow the Horn and Warn the People. And it seems like a large portion of text to cover today, but the reason it's important to cover the entire section is because it's made up of three individual parables. Three parables, and so there is a textual insight, a textual marker that we want to be aware of when we're reading, and it's something called sequence or series. A sequence or a series. Let me just read you the definition, and then I'll tell you a little bit about it. When several stories or parables follow one after the other, you should look for the combined overall effect of the stories or the parables. That's one of the methods. I think last week I called that repetition. But repetition is when we see a word that gets repeated throughout the text or a phrase that gets repeated throughout the text. But I'm going to call this other textual marker sequence or series. When you see three parables stacked up next to each other, when you see three healing stories, 4 or 5 healing stories, when you see 3 or 4 or 5 random stories that are just stacked up right next to each other, most likely, instead of digging into the details of every single aspect of those, most likely what the author is trying to convey is a feeling or an emotion based on the combined cumulative effect of all 3 or 4 or 5 of the stories or parables. And so today, rather than analyze and break apart individually each parable in detail, I don't think that's the point. I think the value of all 3 of them is to say, what do all 3 have in common? What is the combined overall effect of all 3 parables when we see them together at the same time? So I'll try to give you an example of that. Prior to what we have today, and it is a great sadness of mine that I'm not smarter, but by the time we get to a set of 3 parables, a unique set of 3 parables in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, unfortunately, we've already forgotten that there was also a unique set of 3 parables way back in Matthew chapter 21. So we would have wanted to use this same logic back in Matthew 21. So let me take you back to Matthew 21. The 3 parables back there in Matthew 21, I don't know if you'll remember them, but Jesus is telling the Pharisees. Jesus is talking to his adversaries, and that's an important part of interpreting the purpose of the parable. So in Matthew 21, Jesus is talking to Pharisees, he's talking to his adversaries, he's talking to the people who are fighting and opposing him. And he looks directly at them and he gives them 3 parables. He tells them a parable, a father that had 2 sons. And he tells them, father had 2 sons. He tells them both go work in the field. One says, okay, Dad, I will, but he never goes. The other one says, no, Dad, I don't want to, but later on he does work in the field. And Jesus asked the Pharisees which one of the sons did the will of the Father. And the purpose of that parable, they say the second son. Even though he said, I don't want to, later on he did. They said the second son did the will. And he says, that's exactly right. And the purpose of that, he said, oh, did I give you each of these? Oh, I'm sorry. I should have given them to you. Matthew 21, the purpose of that first parable, he said, the tax collectors and the prostitutes will get into the kingdom of heaven before you do. That's the first one. The second one was the tenants of a vineyard. And he said, what do you think? A master lent out his vineyard to the tenants. He sent some prophets to the tenants. They killed them all. He finally sent his son to the tenants. They killed the son. What do you think will do to those tenants? And then the interpretation is, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you. The third parable, those that were invited to a wedding feast. A lot of people were invited to a wedding feast, but he said, the people that I invited didn't come. And the purpose of that parable, the feast was ready, but the ones that I invited were not worthy of coming in. So when you look at all three of those, what's the combined total effect of all three of those? And it's something like what I wrote here at the bottom. The kingdom of heaven is going to be taken away from you and given to somebody else. That's the repetitious theme in those three parables to the Pharisees. Kingdom will be taken from you and given to someone else. Another example, which we looked at last week, was the three very short stories in last week's sermon. I'll remind you of them. Three very short stories. Noah and the flood. We had Lot and his family and Sodom and Gomorrah. And we had the homeowner that was ready and prepared for the thief in the night. What would be the combined cumulative effect of all three of those stories? And it was, the overall effect is be ready and be prepared. It's the explanation of who gets left and who gets taken. So today, there's another set of three that we're going to have. This set of three that we're looking at today in our text is who is the faithful and wise servant, the 10 virgins that were supposed to keep oil for their lamps, and the parable of the talents. Typically, we have always heard each of those broken apart in detail, almost as if they were allegory. Allegory means you try to figure out what every single part of the parable is. The master must be God. The righteous people must be the church. The wicked people must be the scribes and the Pharisees. We break it down and try to treat it as an allegory. Everything has a one-to-one relationship, but in reality, they don't. It's just a general story that's designed to give you a general cumulative impression after you understand all three of the stories. So in the faithful and wise servant story, he said, your job is to give the people their food at the right time. In the 10 virgin story, something strange, 5 of them had plenty of oil, 5 of them ran out of oil. In the parable of the talents, 2 people worked really hard, 1 person was lazy. That's really the basic feel of the parables. What do you gather from all that? Well, that's going to be the point of today's sermon. What do we gather from these 3 parables? I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Something else I'd like to make you aware of is another intratextual marker is repetition. In last Sunday's sermon, just as a reminder, the word that got repeated over and over and over in last Sunday's sermon was stay awake because you don't know the day or the hour. You don't know the day or the hour. So there's a sensation of telling his disciples, be on pins and needles, be anxious, be ready, be alert because you don't know the day or the hour. And it's valuable for us to recognize those same phrases, you don't know the day or the hour, come over into today's text, and they're continued to be used in the text we're looking at today. So as a reminder, last week, chapter 24 and verse 42, stay awake for you don't know what day the Lord is coming. Verse 44, be ready because the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not know. In today's verses, the parable of the faithful and wise servant is going to end with verse 50. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him and at an hour that he does not know. That's useful for us to key in on that repetition, to know that we're linking this with the previous section and we're still continuing talking about the same thing. There hasn't been a transition text. There hasn't been a change of theme. He's still talking about judgment is going to come on Jerusalem. And you better be ready and prepared so that you will see the signs and know when to get out of town before destruction comes on the city. So he's continuing the thought. In the parable of the 10 virgins, we find it also. In the parable of the 10 virgins, verse 13, watch therefore, because you know neither the day or the hour. So when we see that, we recognize that he's still talking about the same thing as last Sunday's sermon, but he's giving parables that are emphasizing this idea of what it might be like to not be ready when the day comes. And that's the purpose of these parables. So the sermon topic today, the one question, the one topic today, what is the collective theme of all three of the parables today? Let's see if we can nail that down. Before we get into reading the parables in the text, the tone of Matthew chapter 24 and 25 has a very similar sound and effect of the way the prophets used to speak when there was judgment and wrath that was about to come on a nation. God would send a prophet to that nation to warn them about what was coming. And the language was to that prophet, that God was sending to warn people that destruction was coming, the language was, if you go warn them that destruction is coming, and they choose to ignore your warning, well, then their blood is on their own head because they ignored the warning. But if I send you to warn people judgment is coming and you don't warn them, and the sword comes and they're destroyed, well, then their blood will be on your head because you did not warn them. God always does that. Before destruction, He always sends word through the prophets. Destruction is coming, you better get right with God. Destruction is coming, you better get right with God. Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Isaiah, Zechariah, all of those guys had that message. So let me help get you in the right frame of mind and in the right tone for, hey, when I give you a job to go warn people about judgment, you need to go do that job. That is what Jesus is telling His disciples, that they are going to need to be warning people about the coming kingdom and the coming judgment. Otherwise, Jerusalem's blood is going to be on your head if you don't go warn them. Let me get you in the right mood for that. I'm going to take you to Ezekiel chapter 33 and show you that kind of familiar Old Testament language. Ezekiel chapter 33 and verse 1. And the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, speak to your people and say to them, if I bring the sword upon a land, and the people of the land take a man from amongst them and make him their watchman, and if he sees the sword coming upon the land and blows the trumpet and warns the people, then if anyone who hears the sound of the trumpet does not take the warning, and the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be on his own head. He heard the sound of the trumpet and did not take the warning. His blood will be upon himself. But if he had taken the warning, he would have saved his life. Verse 6. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, so that the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any one of them, the person that is taken away in his iniquity, that person is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hand. God tells his prophets to go into a country and announce to them that God is bringing destruction on their nation. The day of the Lord is coming. Repent. And if you don't do that, and destruction comes on people that are not ready, he said, the blood of those people will be on your head. Very valuable background to why it was so important that Jesus' disciples be vigilant after he leaves. They need to be vigilant, telling Jerusalem, warning Jerusalem, you better repent. The axe is already at the root of the trees. This generation is going to pay for all the righteous deaths that have happened throughout history. You guys are going to be the ones to pay. Destruction is coming. They've got 40 years to get that message out to Jerusalem before the Romans come, destroy Jerusalem in AD 70. It's a profound responsibility. Let me continue in Ezekiel verse 7. So you, son of man, he's talking to Ezekiel, I have made a watchman for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you should give them a warning from me. If I say to the wicked, O wicked one, you shall surely die, and you do not speak to warn the wicked to turn him from his way, that wicked person will die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hands. Ezekiel, you better go warn people that judgment day is coming. Retribution is coming. Destruction is coming on people that break their covenant with the living God of creation. If you are not walking right with me, if you are not in a good relationship with me, if you are walking in an unholy, unrighteous manner, destruction is coming for you. And Ezekiel, if you don't get out and tell people that message, then when destruction does come on that person, I'm going to hold you accountable for their blood. Verse 9. But if you warn the wicked and turn him from his way, and he does not turn from his way, well, that person shall die in his iniquity, but you will have saved your soul. That's the background, that's the tone that we should be understanding that Jesus is using when he's about to tell these parables about how important it is for the disciples to do their job and get the message out. Don't be slack. And we'll remember one of the texts said, you won't even get done going throughout all of Judea before Judgment Day comes. You won't get done going throughout all of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So get busy and get to work. That's the tone of this section of text. Let me remind you that Jesus sent out his disciples with exactly this mission. Matthew chapter 10, Like I said, it's unfortunate that we forget what we've already read in these past chapters. So let's be reminded, here is the mission that Jesus told his disciples, similar to Ezekiel's. Matthew 10 and verse 6. But go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Verse 15, truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. You guys have got a job to do. Hopefully they're going to listen to you and heed your warning. But if they don't, shake the dust off your feet and go somewhere else. But you better keep doing this and stay busy, because you're not going to even be done by the time I come back in wrath and judgment on Jerusalem. They've got 40 years. So that's the background and that's the tone of chapters 24 and 25. Let me get into the parables and let's look at some intratextual markers that help us figure out the purpose of the parable. On your sheets, we'll be looking at number 1, the faithful and wise servant. And I believe if you sit with the text long enough, what eventually comes out that you see is that each parable has what I have called a pair of adjectives. There's a pair of adjectives, 1 and 2, a first and a second adjective that describe two different kinds of disciples. Each one of these parables is about his disciples, and he uses these adjectives to connect the whole story. So let me point those out to you. Let's start in verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant? Those are your first two adjectives. Whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. Verse 48, watch for the next adjective. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour that he does not know, and he will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. He's making it clear to his disciples there's no time for dilly-dallying. That's a theological term you learn later on in upper level studies. Dilly-dallying. No time for dilly-dallying, you guys. Notice what I think is the glue that binds all of these parables together, the adjectives. The faithful and wise servant in verse 45, that wicked servant in verse 48. Which one are you going to be? The one that when the master comes home, he rejoices and he brings you into the kingdom and brings you glory? Or are you going to be the servant that when the master comes home and sees you, he's going to cut you into pieces and throw you out into utter darkness? Which one are you going to be? Powerful language, isn't it? Powerful language. So what's the apparent concept? We might take a guess, starting in this parable, is that the faithful and wise servants will be doing their job when the master comes home. But there are going to be some wicked servants who are going to go right back to the life they were living before Jesus ever touched their heart. Which one of those do you want to be? One gets rewarded, one gets cut to pieces. That's the overall concept of the parable. Number 2, the parable of the 10 virgins. Let's watch for a pair of adjectives in this one. Chapter 25 and verse 1. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 of them were wise. There's your adjectives. Let me put a pin in the sermon for just a moment before we go on and read the rest of that parable. Those 2 adjectives should kind of remind us of other biblical passages that have spoken of the wise man and the foolish man. If I give you a moment, can you think of a passage? The wise man, but the foolish man, instead of glossing over these words very quickly, we should stop and go, what is the biblical understanding? What is the biblical mood or image behind the word foolish, a foolish person, and the word a wise person? Let me take you to one set of verses where we see this foolish and wise idea. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 24. Everyone who hears the words of mine and does them, that's our key. Well, he is like a wise man. Built his house on a rock. There's your wisdom. Wisdom is hearing what Jesus tells you and doing exactly what he says to do. Wisdom, a wise person. What about a foolish person? Verse 26. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them is like a foolish person. He builds his house on the sand. And when the storm and the weather comes, his entire world collapses. So there is the connotation of wise and foolish. Well, carry that over into our parable today. There are 5 wise virgins. I think that probably means bridesmaids. Probably a little bit more modern language. 5 bridesmaids that are foolish and 5 bridesmaids that are wise. Let's continue the parable. Verse 3. When the foolish ones took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise ones took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and they fell asleep. And at midnight there was a cry, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him." I'll pause because we know the story. But what happens is the foolish bridesmaids are not ready. They're not prepared. They have failed to do their job. Those of you that have gone to find a wedding, bridesmaids have certain functions, grooms, men have certain functions, and if you don't do your function, you kind of mess things up. So the idea of these bridesmaids, I know it's typical to figure out what is the lamp, what is the oil. They want to dig into the details and analyze each one of the aspects of the verse, but I don't think that's what they're intended for. It's intended to convey a general idea when you look at all 3 of them together. And so the foolish ones aren't prepared. They didn't do their job, so they run off to buy oil. The wise ones that have been doing their jobs, that are ready, they go into the wedding ceremony, and the scripture says, and the door was shut. That might evoke some other biblical stories in our mind. The door was shut and it was too late to get in. Can you think of another biblical story where that applies? That's what we're looking for. That's what's happening. When we're rich and full of Scripture, we recognize some of these illusions. So he goes on in verse 10, those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut. Afterwards, the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open up to us. But he said, truly I say, I don't know you. There are multiple allusions to various Bible verses in that. I'll point them out. So the idea of they got there late and the door was shut and it was too late. That brings to mind Noah and the flood. People that didn't get in when they were supposed to, the door was shut and it was too late. They cried out, Lord, Lord, open it up for us. That's a reminder of the people in the flood. It is also a reminder of a previous scripture in Matthew 7 where Jesus says, not everybody who calls me Lord, Lord is going to get in. And then when they cried out to him, Lord, open the door for us, he says, I don't know you guys. And in Matthew 7, when they cry out to him, Lord, Lord, didn't I do prophecies? Didn't I do miracles in your name? He said, get away from me because I never knew you. There's a lot of things getting mixed into this verse. Let me take you to Matthew 7 so you can see the similarities in what this parable of the virgins crying out, Lord, Lord, let me in. And he says, get away, I never knew you. Look at the similarities in Matthew 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name drive out demons, perform many miracles? But I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. You didn't heed the warnings. You didn't do your job. You weren't prepared. You weren't faithful. You weren't obedient. Now the door has been shut. It's too late. Destruction is coming. What is the apparent concept then in the 10 virgins, the 10 bridesmaids? Well, there were a group of people who did the job they were supposed to do, and they got to go into the wedding feast and celebrate the wedding feast. There was another group of people that didn't do what they were supposed to do, didn't heed the warnings, and they were kicked out, not allowed in. Very similar to the last one. Let's look at the third parable, the parable of the talents. And this one is interesting as well because when we read the parable of the talents, we tend to think of that as everybody's been given a talent. You better use your talents, wisely in the kingdom. And there might be some value in that. I don't want to take away from that, but I don't think that's where we're supposed to go. I think we're supposed to look for the adjectives. So let me show them to you. Third example, the parable of the talents, and we're looking for pairs of adjectives. Here we go, verse 14. It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2 talents, and to another 1, each one according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 more. So also, he who had 2 talents made 2 more. But he who had received 1 talent went and dug it in the ground and hid the master's money. So if you were to give a fundamental overview of that, 3 laborers, 2 of them did what they were supposed to do. 2 of them got busy and went to work. 1 of them did nothing. That seems to be the recurring theme in all 3 parables. A handful of people that do what they're supposed to do, a handful of people that don't do what they're supposed to do. And the consequences are tremendous for the people that don't do what they were supposed to do. So in the parable, the master returns, and this is where I'd like you to pay attention to the double adjectives as he talks to each one of his servants. Verse 21, his master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, "Master, you delivered me 2 talents. Here I've made 2 more." And his master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Those are your adjectives. But now we get to the last guy that didn't do anything. Verse 24, the last guy also received 1 talent, came forward, and he said, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed. I was afraid. I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here it is. Here's what's yours." But his master said, "You wicked, lazy servant." Another pair of adjectives. I would offer to you guys that it is the adjectives that is tying all 3 of these parables together. So what we have in this imagery of this parable is they're going to be good and faithful servants that work and do what their master expected them to do, and they're going to be rewarded and giving exceedingly abundantly more than what they worked for. And there is going to be another group of people that are going to be wicked and lazy. And that person is going to end up worse off than they were before the master left. Why do I say worse off? Because the master takes what he has and takes it away from him and gives it to someone else. So he ends up with less than what he started with. So again, we see that 2 groupings, good and faithful servants that do the work they're supposed to do while the master's gone, wicked, lazy servants who don't do anything, and they end up much worse off. Finally, another little intratextual marker that I've talked about in the past is an aphorism. When we find an aphorism, just as a reminder, an aphorism is a clever little phrase that has a truthful meaning behind it. Aphorisms are like, is it the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Clever, cute little phrase, but it has a truthful meaning to it. Another one might be, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. These are aphorisms. Typically, when we see an aphorism in our text, it tends to summarize the point of the whole text. So now let's move on to the aphorism in verse 29. Verse 29, "For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." The reason I call that an aphorism, it sounds kind of long and strange to us, but of interest to us is that exact same phrase is used 5 times in the Bible. And in those 5 times, 3 of the times, it's used for different circumstances. So this seems to be a catch-all aphorism that gets used to sort of sum up the idea that when you are diligent and hard at work, like a parable, people that are diligent and hard at work, people that are getting after it in our language, will tend to continue to do well. On the other hand, people that are lazy and not getting after it, their life keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Some of us have probably witnessed that in people's life. I met a young lady I was talking to, and I was so impressed by her. I assumed she was in her 20s. So impressed, she said that she works, makes her dinner, and I kind of made a comment like, yeah, that doesn't leave time for much else. You work all day, you go home, you make dinner, not much time for much else. And she corrected me. And she said, oh, there's a lot of other stuff that I do. After dinner, I go to the gym. After I go to the gym, I take my dog down to the dog park and I walk my dog. And she just listed these. And on the weekends, I do this and I clean. And this girl was so impressive to me. She's getting after it. And the aphorism here says that type of a person will succeed, will be blessed, will continue to multiply blessing. But how about the other person that's not getting after it? They're in their 30s and they're still sitting in their mom and dad's basement playing video games. How is that person's future going to look? That's the purpose of this aphorism. The one who's not getting after it, even what he has will be taken away from him. You're just going to peter out. This idea that the guy that's not getting after it is going to suffer. Let me take you to a proverb. Proverb chapter 6, verses 10 through 11. I'm afraid this might sound like a lot of modern day teenagers. Let's see here. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. And poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. It's not a good idea to not be busy, to be slothful, to kill too much time. Let me put a pin in the sermon right here. You may have already thought about this. This may be a little political, but this is part of the problem with modern day social programs. Modern day programs that hand people money so that they don't have to work. Now, in a very few circumstances, it's probably necessary. But I'm telling you that I'm going down to 7-Eleven around midnight. It sounds strange, but I don't usually get to bed before 2, and sometimes I got to make a Skittles run. So I'm down to 7-Eleven at midnight, and what I'm seeing is groups of, I would guess, 18-year-olds, 19, 20-year-olds that are getting Mountain Dews and Skittles and sliced pizzas and putting it on a, what's the card called? Not a debit card, EBT, social food, government food. Food, what we used to call food stamps. I don't know what that's called anymore. An EBT card, I think is what they're called. They're in the middle of the night, they're buying the worst possible thing that you could stick in your mouth, and they're paying for it with food stamps, which means they can't be working or making very much money because they'll take your food stamps away. And there's this never-ending cycle of slothfulness and laziness because I don't want to lose my $800 a month. I think I'm getting off on a tangent, but it seems like it's just not a good idea to create a way for people to not have to get up and go to work. It's not a good thing. Life caves in on people like that, and it's unfortunate. So, what's the combined, here's the answer to our sermon topic. What is the combined total effect of all of these parables? And it is that good, faithful, wise servants will be busy doing the master's work, and they will be rewarded. But there is another group of people who will be wicked and lazy and foolish, and they will be chopped up, kicked out, and destroyed when the master comes. I think we can see that all of those are the same warning that Ezekiel gave. You guys go out, blow the horn, and warn the people. Let them know destruction is coming on Jerusalem. It is imminent. It is inevitable. It's going to happen in this generation. You guys are going to see the Son of Man coming in judgment and destruction on covenant breakers. You'll witness this, but I will also give you the signs that you will need, so that when you see these signs, get out of Jerusalem, get out of Judea, and you will be that good, faithful, wise servant that is saved. And everybody that stays in Jerusalem, that does not heed your warning, that does not listen to you, they're going to be swallowed up by the sword. That's the combined total effect. The kingdom is coming. Destruction is just around the corner. And all of these things will come upon this generation. You're not going to be finished warning all of Israel before you see the Son of Man coming in judgment.